Well, I like the way you soft pedaled this a little bit about how there's some interesting stories out there. There's some BS out there, is what there is. So I'm here to talk about myth-busting Manhattan Beach, and good morning to you. I'm Gary McAulay. And for those of you that, and yes, I'm going to read a lot. For those of you that know me pretty well, you know this is really early in the morning for me. And for those of you that don't know me, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm not quite a native of the South Bay, but my parents did move to the beach cities when I was about 3 months old. Wow, I'm already off on my video here. There we are, moved to South Bay when I was about 3 months old, which was a while back. And I was raised in Redondo and graduated from Redondo High in 1972. Yes, that's me.
Guilty.
So go Seahawks. And after some college, I lived first in Redondo and then a couple of years in Hermosa. And I lived in Manhattan. And my sons are both Manhattan Beach natives, although mostly, of course, most native kids today are actually born in Torrance, as you all know. Anyway, although I myself was born in Minnesota, I spent about 4 years in San Pedro when I bought my first house. But outside of that, I've lived in Redondo, in the South Bay for basically my entire life.
And Gary, so the first myth you're busting is if the young people say they were born in Manhattan Beach, that's a lie.
Not really true. I did run into somebody that he swore up and down he was born in his house in Manhattan Beach. I don't know how that happened though. Anyway, so my great-grandfather, Samuel McAulay, came to America from Scotland shortly following the Anglo-Boer War, in which he served as a member of the 5th Regiment, the Northumberland Fusiliers, except it looks like my great-granddaddy was telling a little bit of a story. The British censuses show him living and working in the UK during the war, and he doesn't appear in the military records anywhere, and he's not on any of the military rosters, and I've never seen a picture of him in uniform. But this is to illustrate a point. He does not stand alone. The truth is, lots of folk have been known to exaggerate their accomplishments. And I'm sure that none of you has ever told the story about the one that got away. But I'll guess that you know somebody that has. And the thing is that simple, tall tales are only one way that history gets distorted. Faulty memories. Seriously, people's memories are not what people think they are. We have terrible memories. I've got the worst. It's hard to remember things. We forget things, we mix them up. Even if something happens right in front of you and they ask 3 witnesses, what just happened? You'll get 3 different stories. It just happened right in front of them. You get 3 different stories. And if you think none of this is true, just ask any husband and wife exactly what happened last Thanksgiving dinner. Guarantee you're going to get 2 different stories. Anyway, and then there's simply poor reporting, which is multiplied when those reports are cited as source material years later. Then there's the telephone effect, right? You tell somebody, they tell somebody else, by the time it gets to the end, it's all wrong. It's all wrong. Then there's purposeful manipulation of facts. Sometimes the reporter or the storyteller has an agenda. And we all have biases in our perceptions. There are incomplete records, incomplete research, clerical errors, ordinary typos. We all make mistakes. Then, whether it's deliberate or unintentional, errors get recorded and repeated. Once it's written down, that report or article or book becomes a resource. to be referenced or simply plagiarized. And especially thanks to the internet, once it's out there, it's forever. It's almost impossible to undo something once it hits the net. Sometimes a version of a story is only an opposing viewpoint. Somebody thinks, I don't think it happened quite that way, that sort of thing. Sometimes they're trying to, well, there's lots of reasons why people have these things. But what it leaves the historian is in the position of they have to decide what's the right story. What is the correct story? Is this guy wrong? Do you have to re-research all of their stuff if you're using this person for a source? Or do you just tell all the different versions and let the reader decide which is correct? I mean, there's just multiple ways this can go wrong. Anyway, keep in mind that like all amateur historians, and academics as well, sometimes sources are in error. That means that the next historian must find corroboration or decide to rely on the original researcher's work and his credibility. Sometimes the sources are in conflict. It makes it hard to find it. History is really slippery. It's a really slippery thing. With all that in mind, though, let's talk about some of the things, some of the myths of Manhattan Beach. Please understand that many of these stories have been around for a long time, and many of them have previously been debunked. But I'm amazed at how many of these stories persist, and how many stories people say, really? I didn't know that wasn't true. I mean, it's just incredible. I go through this all the time. We get a lot of questions at the Historical Society, obviously. And I'm not sure that when I tell you my version of the real history that I'm going to change anybody's mind. You may disagree with me, and that's fine too, and I welcome anybody who's got a valid source that wants to make a correction or to bolster any story. So if you have anything that you want to know, that you want to add, I'm open to that. I'm just an amateur historian, just the facts. That's all I'm looking for is just the facts. So, being a history sort of guy, I usually work in chronological order, kind of, sort of, as best as I can. And so what has been written about Manhattan Beach in its earliest days? Naturally, in the old days, yeah, there we are. Naturally, in the old days, Indians lived in Manhattan Beach, right? Well, not really. Not really. No, the Indians did not live in Manhattan Beach, except in the grand overall version of living in Manhattan Beach. Much as we all live in Los Angeles, the Indians lived in Manhattan Beach. But the reality of it is, my home is actually here in this town, and yours is in this town, or perhaps Hermosa, perhaps Redondo. But we live in LA. So it's the same thing with the Indians. The thing is that back in the day, people would wander around on the sand and they'd find arrowheads or they'd find pottery shards. And the next thing you know, the story grows up that we had burial sites, Indian burial sites in Manhattan Beach. Not true. There are stories, there's one article I read somewhere that said we actually had an Indian village at the south end of Manhattan Beach. Not true. It just, the thing is, and you have to think about this a little bit, we don't have any water in Manhattan Beach. You need a river. You need a river or a lake, some kind of freshwater source, or you can't have a village. It just doesn't work that way. So the nearest Indians that we had living to us, hey, let's try out this laser pointers at the one at the top, is right up there at Bologna Creek. That's a little ways away. It's a long hike on sand dunes. They did pass through town. They did hunt and clamming and fishing and lots of stuff in Manhattan Beach, but they lived at the Bologna Creek where they had water. There's more. Right. So basically, the Gabrielino, Tongva, Cheech Indians. They go by several names, actually. Lived up at Bologna Creek in Sangha up there. And in Redondo Beach, which is another place that everybody thinks that there may have been a village. According to the most current research, do you guys know where the old Essen plant is? And there's a granite pillar out front, and it's marked about the salt lake that used to be there. That place was called something like, let's see if I can pronounce this, Ongovangna, something like that. Research indicates that that may just be a place name. A place name is like you say, I went downtown. I went to the hardware store. Those are place names. And this place was where they got their salt. Not necessarily a village, though. They might have had temporary encampments there. But once again, there's no water. There's no water to support a village. There's also a story that there may have been down at the south end of Redondo Beach into Torrance and right at the foot of PV, there may have been villages down there as well. But the development down there went so fast that really anything that was there got pretty much wiped out. So they know they had villages around on the backside and up there at Bologna Creek, but we live in the middle of nowhere. Manhattan Beach is nothing but sand. It's incredible what we're paying for these sand piles now. Wow. So who were the first residents of Manhattan Beach? He says, oh, hey, there they are. But I obviously missed something, and there's your salt pond back in 1890. And that's the marker I was talking about. You'd think I could find this on this screen right now. Of course, there's a lot of debate about where these, like I said, there are people that insist that we had villages down here and so forth, but the archaeological evidence is scant.
What were those lines?
I'm sorry?
What were those lines? Were they trails?
Going
Were
back
they
up.
train? What were those lines?
Yeah, they're mostly, like this is the old, forget about the pointer. This road is called the Old Salt Road. It goes from LA, where there was, of course, there was an Indian village up in LA at the LA River. And when these guys, the Spanish and Mexicans, came along from New Spain and decided they were going to settle in California and move on up and start setting up missions and what have you, they went up right where the main Indian encampment was, because there was a spring up there and there was a river up there. So there's water to support a town or a village. Where was I on this? So anyway, so they, when the Indians and when the Spaniards and the Mexicans came up into California, they went straight up to LA where there's water available. So Manhattan Beach remained uninhabited. Manhattan Beach was part of a land grant. I'm sure you all heard of Rancho Sazal Redondo, which basically means the round willow grove. But the ranch land was, the ranch house was miles away from Manhattan Beach. So basically we lived in a grazing area and not even a very good one at that. The part of Manhattan Beach, the original part of Manhattan Beach, is of course on a giant sand dune. So there you are at LA up there, and you have this handy river there for some water. We're part of Rancho Salsa Redondo there. But this isn't even good grazing land for cattle. I mean, it's just weeds, or as we like to call them now, native plants. I actually like a lot of the native plants myself, but they were considered weeds a lot. Manhattan Beach was on a gigantic sand dune. The sand dune ran from up at Bologna Creek and ran all the way down to Palos Verdes, and they were just huge sand dunes. The closest thing, it's nothing but sand. I mean, it's just sand and more sand, and weeds.
Do you have any idea what the date of that picture is?
1927, I have that picture.
Thank you. I was going to say, I believe this is from your collection. Yeah, and things were actually starting to fill up in 1927, but when the town was first getting formed, there was nothing. There's just nothing. So fine, who did really live here first? This guy. This guy is Colonel Blanton Duncan. Now you've probably seen Duncan Street. You might have even seen the little Duncan Way and Duncan Drive and so forth up there on the east side of Sepulveda. Sorry, I'm trying to read and talk at the same time. Okay. Colonel Duncan, in about 1895, came along and bought 88 3/4 acres from the Redondo Land Company, which was selling off the former Rancho Salso Redondo. Duncan bought another 100 acres the following year. He's believed to be the first person to actually live in what became Manhattan Beach. Started a ranch with his home on the highest hill in the area, which is now encircled by Duncan Drive and Kuhn Drive east of Sepulveda. Colonel Duncan used to say, "There is no life west of Sepulveda."
That's another myth you just
I
started.
made that up. I totally made that up. But speaking of making things up, there have been a lot of stories told about Colonel Duncan. They're too lengthy to repeat them all here. They're pretty ridiculous, a lot of them. But the gist of it is that just before the Civil War, or during the Civil War, depending on your sources, Colonel Duncan, who was younger at that time, was a plantation owner. And he took his cotton crops and his neighbor's cotton crops and went to England hoping to get a better return on them than he could selling them in Kentucky. And the story goes is that he didn't return to Kentucky with the money, that he just skipped straight away to California with his wife, daughters, and some slaves. And there he became an opium smuggler and built a pier down at First Street. And he was assisted by a Chinese man whom he eventually murdered. And the colonel also supposedly murdered a Spanish don, a romantic Spanish don that was courting his daughter. He supposedly built a lighthouse to signal passing ships and had a tunnel running from his mansion at the east side of Sepulveda all the way down to his pier at First Street in the ocean. That would be a heck of a tunnel, especially in the sand. Naturally, after Duncan died, his home became known as a haunted house, and there were stories of buried treasure on his property. All of these stories have been told about Colonel Duncan. The truth is that he was born in Kentucky in 1827, educated as a lawyer, and dabbled in the law. Turned to politics. He was a secessionist. And when the Civil War came along, he raised a rifle regiment, of which he became then first a major and then a lieutenant colonel. So that's why he has the title of Colonel Duncan. But he wasn't really a military man. So he served under a general for a little while, and then he mustered out and started a business printing banknotes and currency. And so Colonel Duncan printed currency for the Confederacy. That went a little bit sideways too, which always happens if there's lots of money involved somehow. Following the war, he spent a few years in England and France because it was a little unhospitable for ex-Confederates in the United States at that time. And then eventually he came back and became a political activist once again. His daughter and her husband moved to Los Angeles, and Colonel Duncan and his wife followed. He had a home in Los Angeles, as most anybody who had any money did. And he had investment property in Riverside. And like I said, he built a ranch here in Manhattan Beach. He was regarded by his neighbors as eccentric, to put it mildly. He clashed with some of them, and he became embroiled in politics. And eventually, he initiated some lawsuits because the Times called him a, this is good, an erratic bloviator. That is a mouthful. His wife passed away and he became a little more erratic, and eventually he got into a fight with his daughter over his wife's will. They went to court. He lost his lawsuit. Medical doctors declared Colonel Duncan insane, and he died about 6 months later. The house stood for many years. Eventually, the haunted house, it became a haunted house after he was gone, of course, right? And it caught fire, and eventually the city demolished it. Duncan led a colorful life. It was not as colorful as the stories that were told about him. But if any of you are interested in these mini legends, the Historical Society website has a whole article by former President Bonnie Beckerson detailing exactly what his life was about and what is wrong with all of the histories. There are a ton of bad history out on this. But he was, as far as we know, the first documented actual resident of Manhattan Beach. Which brings me to several related stories. You may have heard that Manhattan Beach was first called Shore Acres. You may have heard that developer John Merrill wished to name the city after his old hometown in New York, in Manhattan, New York. You may have heard that the choice between Shore Acres versus Manhattan Beach was decided by a coin toss, and that the beach of Manhattan Beach was only added years later thanks to the postmaster who sent the letter I was telling you about earlier today. They're all great examples of how old stories get repeated and repeated and repeated and just won't go away. Well, what really happened? In 1887, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe reached Los Angeles, which connected LA to the rest of the nation. This was a tremendous thing for LA and for the surrounding area. It touched off a huge land boom because finally they had a fast way to get to LA. Railroad service got extended from Los Angeles to the port of Redondo the following year. And because there was a port in Redondo Beach, that was where the shipping came in. The LA harbor had not yet been scraped up out of the swamp. So the Redondo Hotel opened, and the Redondo Hotel was a tremendous tourist draw. It's a pretty fancy looking place, you know? Yeah. I mean, it was a beaut. Very popular, and the local folks that are interested in speculating on real estate, as they rode the train down from LA, saw all this empty land in between LA and Redondo Beach and said, hey, I know how I'm going to make a buck. And so, this gentleman here, John Shirley Ward, and a few other people incorporated the Potentia Townsite Company. They bought the land that is now Manhattan Beach with plans for a seaside resort, including a fishing and pleasure pier. The area that is now our downtown, that is now our city, was originally named Potentia.
Can you give some dates when you?
Yes, this is about 1897 is when they incorporated, and it remained Potencia until 1901, which is coming right up here. Ward and his company partnered with others to incorporate the Los Angeles Ocean Power Company, also about 1897. And they in turn partnered with the Wright Wave Motor Company to build a so-called wave motor on the iron pier that they had built, where the current pier is currently located. The wave motor was developed by a gentleman named Parvin Wright, and it was intended to harness the endless wave action of the sea to generate electrical power. Now you may have heard this story before, and there's a rumor that the remains of this motor is still buried somewhere underneath the sand. I can pretty much tell you, I mean, I don't know how much experience you have with metal and salt air, but nothing that's 100 years old that's in contact with the ocean. So whatever there may have been is now a rusty hulk. But the original pier, built, like I said, built in 1897, that was our first pier, the Potencia Pier. And you can see the paddles out there at the end of the thing, and those paddles went up and down with the waves, and they pumped some stuff, and it filled up with water and let water run out again and generated electricity, supposedly. According to news articles, it worked out pretty well. Guess I'm getting ahead of myself here. And they were trying to encourage more investors. Well, what happened is, so of course, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad named the train stop, which was at Center Street or Manhattan Beach Boulevard, they named it Potencia. That was the name of the stop, was Potencia. And that was, they named it that in 1897 for people coming to Potencia to see the wave motor and hopefully to buy property. Well, that was all going along okay until, with their pier, until a big storm came along in January of 1899, and it tore away about 30 feet of the iron pier, including the wave motor. Mr. Ward went forward and repaired the pier. I'm not sure whether he tried to repair that wave motor. That's a little bit unclear. But the rebuilt iron pier stood until the winter storms of 1913, 1914. He wasn't the only guy that was trying to do these wave motors. So this one was in Redondo Beach, no, Huntington Beach, I believe. I lost track of which one's which. So one's in Redondo, one's in Huntington. The newspaper reported that there were something like 100, I have it on here somewhere, like 180, 175 different electrical generating schemes. Electricity was still an up and coming thing, but they were trying to figure out how to harness the ocean to make the waves. So why did they name it Potencia, by the way? Well, they named it Potencia according to the article. Potencia is the Spanish word for power, and thus the name was, quote unquote, appropriately given, that Potencia Beach, or Potencia, because of the wave motor and the electricity that's being generated. So when the pier was built, wow, we were the leader in green energy, weren't we? In 1897, we were generating electricity from purely natural sources. So in 1901, There may have been some cottages built in the area, but none have been documented. There were not any commercial buildings yet built in this new town of Potencia. Apparently the Potencia Townsite Company, which advertised itself as the finest bathing beach in the county, but they were too focused on their electrical generating scheme. And with the collapse of the wave motor, first of all with the loss of it, but besides the fact that it simply didn't work, it was a commercial flop. So Potencia, the original beach resort dream, was sold to John A. Merrill. Handsome looking dude, huh? To John A. Merrill and his Manhattan Beach Company in September of 1901. The Los Angeles Herald announced that the new resort to be open to the public was to be called Manhattan Beach. The article raved that taking Redondo, Hermosa, and Manhattan beaches, because Hermosa had been started 5 years earlier, there would be a continuous series of resorts about 6 miles in length, which according to the paper would soon be a series of resorts to be one of the most extensive and beautiful lines of improved beaches in Southern California. The beach cities were born. So why was it called Manhattan Beach? The story oft repeated is it was named after his hometown in New York, like I said. But it turns out John Merrill was born and raised in Beloit, Wisconsin. At age 15, he joined the 40th Wisconsin Volunteers to serve in the Civil War before he went back home to finish high school and then college. Became a Presbyterian minister for a period, but resigned for health reasons. In California, he became interested in real estate. So like I said, there's a boom going on now, right? We've got a train coming to LA and real estate is screaming up in price. So he becomes interested in real estate and in the business of raising oranges, which was another whole big thing at the turn of the century. He did spend 3 years in New York, working at a brokerage before returning to California to resume his real estate ventures. At the end of the 1800s, there was a very famous, very expensive, and very exclusive resort hotel on Coney Island called the Manhattan Beach Hotel. It was so famous that John Philip Sousa actually dedicated a march, the Manhattan Beach March. John Philip Sousa, for those of you who don't know, is a pretty famous composer. So why Manhattan Beach? Well, Merrill, as far as we can tell, was sort of borrowing the name, shall we say. It's a famous resort, so why not name my resort the same thing? And in fact, over a dozen other beach and lakeside resorts, and even resorts in the middle of Chicago, also borrowed the name. Yes, sir.
Can we go back and look at that Manhattan, right there?
Yeah.
Look at that resort. It says Manhattan Beach, you know, and that's their resort. Go back a few slides. Right there. Oh, wait, one slide.
Yeah.
That looks like Manhattan Beach Hotel for New York, Manhattan.
That's
Beach.
correct.
It says Coney Island. It says New York, Coney Island over there. So this was not a planned thing to be locally here.
No, this was a completely separate hotel
Right.
in New York that, and it was a huge resort. In fact, there was a series of resorts on Coney Island, which I'm a little unclear on. I don't think was actually part of New York City yet. It was the outskirts.
But you mentioned this 6 miles of resort. I thought that was going to be a part of it
No. That
here.
was,
Okay.
yeah. That was
Okay.
that was the Manhattan Beach that we
Yeah.
announced when John Merrill decided that he's going to call his place Manhattan Beach, and there's going to be Redondo, Hermosa, Manhattan Beach,
Right.
and that would be the 6 miles of
And I
resorts.
thought you were
Meanwhile, on
saying that
Coney
was-
Island, they were doing it right.
Yeah, okay.
So they had this place, they had Brighton Beach, they had the Oriental Hotel, all those places you see on your boardwalk game, those all existed in real life as big, fancy, overpriced hotels. But so other places, gosh, does it not say on this one? So we had, there's Manhattan Beach in, let's see, I think there's Manhattan Beach, Minnesota, and there's Manhattan, Kansas, and, let's see, that's Manhattan Beach, Denver, Colorado, and Manhattan Beach in Dayton, Kentucky.
There's one in Cleveland, Ohio.
There's one in Ohio. I can't quite read where it, this one's in Chicago. This one's back in Minnesota again, but I kind of like the sign, you know. So that one's in here twice. There are something like, I don't know, 12 or 15 Manhattan beaches or Manhattans across the nation, which is exactly why when we got our post office, the post office goes, you know what, we're going to call you, we're just going to call you Manhattan for the time being, because otherwise it's too confusing with all the Manhattan beaches. So that was their rationale for just call. And this is just within the postal system, but we were the post office of Manhattan versus the post office of Manhattan Beach. This is bathing at Manhattan Beach in New York. Basically, they're just trying to shine up the town a little bit because, seriously, not much here at the time. Nonetheless, so here we are with Manhattan Beach where you could get good lots for $150 and all you had to do is get off the train at Potencia, which was the railroad stop. So what about the story that Manhattan Beach was first called Shore Acres? Obviously that's not true. It was Potencia and it was sold directly to the Manhattan Beach Company. And so we went straight from being Potencia to Manhattan Beach. But so what happened exactly? Well, for reasons that are not quite clear, the railroad decided to change the name of a couple of stations. So the North Ontario station became Upland, and the Potencia station became Shore Acres. There's no reason given in the article for this to happen, but it confused people. So people, because if you get off at a train station and it says Shore Acres, you think that's the name of the town. I mean, I think that's kind of a big leap, honestly, but could just as easily have said Center Street, but it didn't. And so there was a certain amount of confusion, and it was the railroad stop was Shore Acres for about a year and a half, roughly. So the story grew up. Maybe I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here a little bit. Nonetheless, even though you were getting off at the Shore Acres station, as it says right there, that was to go to a development called Verano Beach, which was between Manhattan and North Manhattan. You have to remember that some of these developments they're just housing developments and they're quite small. So somewhere around, 15th Street, a little bit north of that is a Verano Beach. So even though the station said Shore Acres, still at that time, Manhattan Beach was still Manhattan Beach. People were just a little bit confused by it. The maps from the time period say Manhattan Beach. The ads for real estate say Manhattan Beach. And eventually, after a year and a half, they changed the name of the train stop and it became Manhattan Beach at the train stop. This is about 1907. If you can believe the label that somebody put on it. It's kind of tricky that way. So the story goes, the story that you've all heard, is that George Peck wanted to call his property Shore Acres. There's no substantiation for that at all. You can't find an ad for Shore Acres real estate anywhere. Like I said, it doesn't appear on the map. And in fact, his real estate ads during the time period where the station said Shore Acres, he was, that is George Peck was, the manager of the North Manhattan Beach Company. He went with Manhattan Beach. Where are we here now? Yeah, so there's some arguing about the first names of the city, and the story grew up somehow that George Peck wanted to call it Shore Acres, John Merrill wanted to call it Manhattan Beach, and so allegedly they had a coin toss in 1902. There's nothing to substantiate this at all. Like I said, the real estate ads, the maps, everything, even George Peck's very own ads called Manhattan Beach, Manhattan Beach. I'm gonna skip just a little bit ahead here if I can, because I'm starting to wander a tad. The coin flip. The coin flip story doesn't actually appear until many years later. The first reference that I can find to it is in a publication called Community Life, which was published in cooperation with the Manhattan Beach Community Church in the summer of 1945, which is a lot far away from 1902. And in that particular summer issue, there's a story about these three guys, the Doherty brothers. And the Dohertys were well known in town. They did a lot of stuff. The guy in the middle there, Frank, was actually a real estate agent himself. I believe he had the house that you see in the photographs that says beach lots, $150, $10, $50 down, $10 a month. You see those ads. I believe that was Doherty's. But when they interviewed Frank here for the story, he was 82 years old. He had only arrived in Manhattan Beach himself in 1914, well after the alleged coin flip. He didn't witness it. He didn't name a source for the story. It's a completely uncorroborated story. It didn't happen. If you have one guy telling you a story and you have no evidence to back it up whatsoever, not even an independent witness, that's what we call a tall tale. It's just a fable. But the story has been repeated endlessly. And why not? It's such a great story. I mean, come on, it's a great story. As Mark Twain said, nobody likes to let the truth get in the way of a good story. Anyway, the last remaining myth about the names is that Manhattan Beach wasn't officially Manhattan Beach until the postmaster straightened things out. And that story actually was covered back in 1927. Somebody wrote in about it and said, what's the deal? It was explained in the newspaper why the post office was calling it Manhattan instead of Manhattan Beach. The postmaster got it straightened out promptly that year, and to this day, to this very day, people still believe that it was not Manhattan Beach until the post office straightened it out. That's not really true. It was the city of Manhattan Beach from the moment it was incorporated, which was on December 7th of 1912. So speaking of incorporation, another one of my favorite myths is that you'll occasionally see the famous George Peck described as the founder or the co-founder of our town. He was in fact a very significant developer of the north end of Manhattan Beach and El Porto. He also developed much of San Pedro and many other places around Los Angeles. You'll see Peck's name everywhere. He did give land to Manhattan Beach to build a park. That took a few years. I haven't researched this thoroughly, but it appears that the land that he donated was not exactly prime land, which is a good kind of way to offset that is you donate it to the city to build a park. So it took the city a little bit of time to get around to creating Live Oak Park there. He was well known in town. He was well liked. He walked around and threw coins to the kids, according to the old timers. And but the truth of the matter is, not a founder. And in fact, he led the opposition. George Peck led the opposition to incorporation when the city had to have an election to decide, are we going to incorporate? And George Peck didn't want the city of Manhattan Beach to incorporate. He reportedly circulated lengthy petitions that called incorporation wholly undesirable. We have yet to find a copy of that petition. It must exist in some vault somewhere in LA's justice halls. But theory is that he wanted Manhattan Beach to become part of the city of LA. The city of LA was sucking up land left and right, and so we're right about there, right? And they were reaching out and they were trying to take some of the smaller cities and make them part of the city of LA. It's believed that that was kind of what George Peck had in mind. His primary residence was in Los Angeles, after all. He was not a founder. He was a sort of an anti-founder of Manhattan Beach.
Hey, Gary,
Yes, sir.
how did Peck's Pier come about?
How did what?
Peck's Pier?
He was a developer, so when he was selling land, he would build a facility, much like you go to these places now and you get a barbecue room and all the badminton courts and all that stuff that people you have your community hall. So he built a pavilion to draw people to live in his area.
How long did that last? How long was that pier there?
That I don't, off the top of my head, I don't know.
It was like the 30s or 40s?
I'll have to go back to page 1 where I told you my memory is really awful. But no, it didn't last quite that long. I think I want to say it was the end of the 20s.
Oh.
And the timbers start to rot, and then kids play in it, and then it catches fire, and then it gets declared a menace, and then the city has to tear it down. Anyway, so the thing about Peck is that, and this is a story that's kind of tough, is that this the whole story about Bruce's Beach. And that is Bruce's Beach Lodge, or Bruce's Resort, because the beach actually belonged to Peck. Didn't belong to the Bruces. Bruce's had some land, beach belonged to Peck. And I have to challenge the assertions that have been made in the past that George Peck set aside land for minority people. I've not found anything to substantiate this at all. It's said about him, but there are no maps that say this area reserved for minorities or anything of that sort of thing. There's no ads to that effect anywhere. There's nothing showing that land was set aside. It's just a story that developed over time. The thing is, he didn't even sell the lot to the Bruces. Actually, it was I lost the guy's name already. It's in here somewhere, but one of his agents sold the land to the Bruces. It wasn't George Peck himself. Once the Bruces got their resort up and running, and they opened it up. And the very first week after they opened in 1912, The African Americans who went to Bruce's resort found that the beach in front of the resort, which was owned by Peck, had been staked off and no trespassing signs had been posted. 2 deputy constables guarded the property. Half a mile of the beach from Peck's Pier to 24th Street, which was Peck's property, was closed off to them, and they had to go around the ends to get to the surf. So the thing is that Peck, who remained politically active in town, and who was actually, he also objected to the pier. He thought the pier was too long. They could keep it a little shorter and save a bunch of money. And so Peck was not in favor of the new pier that was being built. He wanted it kept down to somewhere at the distance, but I forgot how long it was. But despite his political activism, when the eminent domain proceedings began against the Bruces, he didn't say a thing. He went silent. So he's not really regarded by people that have checked into the history a little bit as being anything more than a businessman. It doesn't make him a bad guy, mind you. Well, I don't know, roping off the beach is probably considered a negative, but he sold land because that's what he did. He sold land. He was a businessman. He sold a lot of land and became very wealthy. But he didn't stick up for anybody. But that brings me to a cheerier story. Waikiki Beach. Because as you know, Manhattan Beach Sand created Waikiki Beach. Everybody knows that, except it isn't true. It's just not true. So this is my favorite myth and one I go crazy about. Manhattan Beach was nothing but a huge, part of a gigantic sand dune system. We had a ton of sand, and if you wanted to put a house down or build roads, you had to level out the dunes and get rid of the excess. So the Kuhn Construction Company sold a lot of sand and shipped it out for a whole lot of reasons. The earliest story I can find on that alleges that this went to Waikiki is from 1952. And in 1952, the reporter wrote that the sand was shipped to, quote, shipped to and used all over the county and Arizona. Some even went to the Hawaiian Islands where it was spread over the pebbles of Waikiki Beach. That's pretty Florida, right? The claim was not attributed to anybody by the author, who later in the article says that the contractor, Kuhn, said the sand was shipped to points all over LA, Arizona, and Hawaii, but the Waikiki story wasn't attributed to the Kuhns originally. That claim comes up in 1973. I mean, there's a lot of sand, you know. And this is the story that I was talking about here, and where it says that it went over the pebbles of Manhattan Beach. But in 1973, Marshall Kuhn was interviewed for a story. He was then 77 years old. And in 1977, his story became that his family struck a deal to sell sand to Waikiki Beach in Hawaii. He claimed that they sold the sand in Hawaii for years and years, and said, quote, "We were the only ones who supplied the sand to build those beaches. If it wasn't for Manhattan Beach's sand, Hawaii might not be what it is today." There's even rumors of a plaque at Waikiki Beach that tells the story and credits Manhattan Beach, et cetera, except that nobody can seem to find this plaque or to take a picture of it, and no picture of it exists. So finally, and I'm not the first person to try to track down this story by a long shot, but I had an email exchange with the administrator of this is a great title, the administrator of the Office of Conservation and Coastal Lands, Department of Land and Natural Resources, State of Hawaii. And a Mr. Samuel Lemo cautiously declined to say that the story was untrue, but he did say, "I've done extensive research on the matter and have not been able to find any evidence of Manhattan Beach sand being placed on Waikiki Beach. One way to really figure it out would be to do a sediment analysis, because California sand is silicate sand and Hawaiian sand is carbonate sand. However, there have been hundreds of sediment analyses done on Waikiki Beach, and I have never seen anyone mention a silicate component." Okay, it's time to feed the dog. My apologies, it's always something. So that's a long way for a scientist to say that he can't really prove a negative, but there's no supporting evidence for the sand of Waikiki story at all. And the funny thing is that there was a story out in another magazine where a city in Australia has the exact same legend, that they sent sand from Australia to create the beach in Waikiki. I don't know how they do it. Anyway, so where does the story come from? Well, basically, Mark Shoemaker, who's one of our local residents, did a bunch of research, and he found this article from 1928 that was all excited because a contract for shipment of a large quantity of sand from Manhattan Beach to Honolulu had just been signed. It's being shipped to the Honolulu Iron Works Company.
That's who you need to check with.
It says, chemists employed by the ironworks found the beach sand to be ideal for one purpose. It's reported that works have been started on excavating it from the dunes and shipped to Honolulu. The Honolulu Ironworks Company used it for commercial purposes, for manufacturing or forging or producing. There's also a process called sand casting, but it didn't go to the beach. It went to Honolulu, so it got close, but it didn't go to Waikiki Beach. Did I answer your question?
I was going to say, in Hawaii, I've even heard them talk about the sand coming from Manhattan Beach.
There's a lot of, you will hear a lot of rumors if you pay attention, but there's no proof of it at all. And the story doesn't come up for, 20 years or 40 years, somewhere in that range where it first comes up. And it just gets embroidered as time goes by. So pretty soon, according to Mr. Kuhn, the whole beach was done by Manhattan Beach, and the guys that do the restoration over there, they're going, there's no California sand on our beaches. It just doesn't exist. Yes.
What about the sand being as ballast in the ships?
That's quite possible. Sand makes great ballast, But
And then it was dumped there, and then they took.
yeah, but they didn't. If they dumped it, they didn't dump it on Waikiki Beach.
Okay.
Then all the geologists, like I said, they've done hundreds of analyses of these things, and it's two distinct kinds of sands. And they're kind of going, yep, this is all Hawaiian sand. They do replenish their beaches, but they do it with local sand, which is all this carbonate-based sand, as opposed to our silicate sand. Anyway, it was basically used for industrial manufacture. So you should be pretty bored with me by now, and so I'm going to wrap this up just to say
Gary,
that...
before you leave that,
yes.
I heard that they used Manhattan Beach sand in the base of the Coliseum.
That's something I haven't been able to verify.
Have you seen it? Have you heard it though?
I have heard it's in the same article as the one that says that the sand went to Waikiki
Okay.
Beach.
And you were talking about the one in Rome, of course.
Supposedly used to help construct the Pacific Coast Highway, hauled it up through town. And it was supposedly used as ballast in ships, and was supposedly used to help create the floor of the Coliseum in LA. But I don't really have verification on any of these things. Those things all show up in the same article as the Waikiki story, so you kind of have to take it with a grain of salt. A lot of this stuff, unfortunately, isn't, so finding the records 100 years later is kind of hard. The only reason this particular story came up is because it was kind of a big deal for them to ship it off to Hawaii at all. so it made the newspaper. But they were very specific about it going to this metal company, this forgery.
The sand, all the sand they're talking about, was it from what we call the beach, or was it from the hills?
Oh, it's from the hills. Here's a good example. One of my favorite places, Manhattan Beach, is at Highland and Fifth. And there's a little yellow house there that's sitting up in a yard that's about this high,
Yeah.
all by itself. And the reason is because that house was built before they leveled the streets. So the house is there, and when they leveled the street, they kind of had to build a wall around the sand there so that the house could stay where it was, but the streets all had to be, the sand had to be leveled out. It was, think of Sand Dune Park and the giant dune there. Everything was rolling hills of sand, and they shifted quite a bit with the wind. The dunes shifted quite a bit, and they pretty much had to stabilize everything. So they leveled it out the best they could and threw down a bunch of ice plant to root and hold the sand in place. And everybody held their breath, and over a period of time, eventually they got things completely covered in asphalt concrete. And all of us, everybody that had a house at the beach suddenly didn't have a house at the beach anymore. So now you have to go to the beach to have the beach. But once upon a time, it was just a lot of sand and weeds, native plants. Anyway, so maybe at some later date, I might talk about the birthplace of beach volleyball, which was not Manhattan Beach.
State Beach.
And maybe I'll talk about the red car conspiracy, which, basically cars and buses were just faster and cheaper and more flexible, and it was pretty complicated, but it was just that the red cars were on their way out for a very long time. Velzy's Surf Shop, which is reputed to be the first surf shop anywhere in the world, and so on and so forth, but the only person that can back that up was Velzy himself. There's no paperwork on it anywhere that anybody's found yet to date. But according to Velzy, he had the first licensed official surf shop. And about how the Doors practiced in Manhattan Beach. Some members that eventually became the Doors practiced in Manhattan Beach, but the Doors as a designated group, not really. One last, yeah, they were pretty happy to get buses, as a matter of fact. The yellow car lines were a kind of a problem. There's Velzy's for you. The Doors. And my last myth, that Manhattan Beach opened in 1927. Nope. It was a dry goods store in 1928, and that's pretty thoroughly documented. And one of our members, Kristen Long, is researching Ercles very thoroughly, and she's pretty confident that she's nailed down the opening date as the end of July in 1929. So just a couple of years, but 1927, not quite correct. Nonetheless, a fine place to go. Anyway, that's basically it. I hope you enjoyed it. And